Do you believe that there are people who are destined to enter our lives, even if it is in the most unexpected way, just like Vittorio and Augine on that rainy road? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? The faint scent of antiseptic mingled with death. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as Vittorio Kang's eyelids fluttered open. His vision blurred, then cleared enough to see a woman's silhouette backlit by the harsh hospital lights. She stood frozen in the doorway, clutching what looked like a small stuffed animal. The moment lingered, suspended in time, before reality crashed back into focus. Who? He managed to rasp, his throat painfully dry. Her eyes widened in panic. For just a second, time suspended between them, long enough for him to notice the softness of her gaze and the curve of her lips, familiar somehow, like a half-remembered dream. Then she was gone, disappearing down the corridor before he could force his broken body to move. Wait. The word died in his throat, replaced by a fit of coughing that brought the nurses running. "Mr. Kang, you need to stay still. You've been in a serious accident," the nurse admonished, adjusting his fore. But Vittorio wasn't listening. He was fixated on the doorway where the mysterious woman had stood. Who was she? And why did he feel, even in his semi-conscious state, that she was running from him? The question haunted him as darkness claimed him once more, pulling him back into dreamless sleep. 3 months earlier, when autumn leaves were just beginning to change, Vittorio Kang lived his life in fifth gear. Always had. Tonight was no different as he maneuvered his silver Maserati through the winding roads outside Milan, windows down despite the autumn chill. The speedometer climbed above 160 km per hour as he took each curve with practiced precision, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. This was his therapy: speed, control, danger. The only time the noise in his head quieted. The cool night air rushed through the car, carrying with it the earthy scent of rain-soaked pavement. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver glow across the countryside. His phone rang through the car's speaker system. The name Jinwoo flashed on the dashboard screen. His father. Again. 3rd time this week. Vittorio jabbed the decline button with more force than necessary. "I don't need another lecture about the family business," he muttered to himself, accelerating into the next turn. The engine roared in response, its powerful vibration traveling up through the steering wheel and into his bones. At 32, Vittorio had built his own luxury hotel chain across Europe, refusing to ride his family's coattails in Korea. He'd created his empire through sheer force of will and ruthless business acumen. His face graced the covers of business magazines from Milan to Manhattan. Women desired him, men envied him. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, their golden glow giving way to the cool blue of evening, Vittorio pushed his car faster, seeking that elusive moment when sensation overtook thought. He had everything. So why did emptiness gnaw at him every quiet moment? Vittorio pushed the thought away and pressed the accelerator harder as rain began to spatter the windshield. Miles away, in a small apartment above a bookstore in central Milan, Augine woke with a start. She'd had that dream again, the one where she was 16, scribbling notes in a small journal while the little boy with sad eyes asked her to read him another story. The dream had become more frequent lately, creeping into her subconscious with increasing persistence as autumn deepened. She'd awake with the phantom sensation of a child's small hand in hers, the ghost of a voice asking, "Just one more, please?" Shaking off the memory, she glanced at her alarm clock, 5:30 a.m. Early, but she might as well get up. The bookstore inventory wouldn't do itself. Outside her window, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading into the pale gray of dawn. Augine's morning routine was methodical, like everything else in her life. Exactly 20 minutes of yoga. A precisely measured cup of green tea. Breakfast, 2 eggs, a slice of toast. Her life was an exercise in control, the opposite of her chaotic childhood. As morning light filtered through her kitchen window, casting long shadows across her small dining table, Augine reviewed her day's schedule in her mind. The wholesale book market first, then back to the store to process new arrivals before opening at 10 o'clock. By 6:45 a.m., she was backing her modest Fiat out of the small garage behind her apartment building. The rain had started, a light drizzle that would make her drive to the wholesale book market slippery but manageable. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically as she drove through the still quiet streets of Milan, most of the city still asleep at this early hour. She checked her watch. If she took the scenic route through the hills, she'd still arrive with time to spare before meeting her supplier. The narrow road wound its way upward, offering glimpses of the city below through breaks in the trees. As she navigated a particularly sharp curve, Augine slowed, cautious of the increasingly slick pavement. The rain was falling steadily now, drumming on the roof of her car. Fate, it seemed, had plans to interrupt their carefully ordered lives. As the morning light strengthened, painting the rain clouds with pink and gold, two souls hurtled toward an intersection that would change everything. Vittorio took the hairpin turn too fast, the rain-slicked road offering less traction than he'd anticipated. His tires lost their grip, sending the Maserati into a sickening spin across the center line. Time slowed, each moment stretching into eternity as the car twirled like a deadly ballet dancer on the wet asphalt. Augine saw it all in horrifying slow motion, the sleek silver car fishtailing around the bend, heading straight toward her. She swerved instinctively, but there was nowhere to go on the narrow road. The impact was deafening, metal crumpling against metal as her small Fiat was thrown back into the guardrail. The world tilted and spun, a kaleidoscope of rain and shattered glass and twisted metal. For a moment, everything went silent except for the gentle hiss of steam rising from both engines. The smell of burned rubber and hot metal filled the air, mingling with the petrichor of rain-soaked earth. A bird called somewhere in the distance, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. Augine's airbag had deployed, leaving her dazed but conscious. She unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling hands and pushed open her door. Rain fell on her face as she struggled to her feet, assessing herself for injuries. Miraculously, she seemed relatively unharmed, a few cuts, probably some bruises tomorrow, but nothing serious. She touched her forehead, fingers coming away with a small smear of blood. Nothing serious. The other car had taken the worst of it, having spun completely around before slamming into a tree. Steam rose from its crumpled hood, dissipating in the cool morning air. Through the rain, which was now falling in earnest, she could make out a figure slumped over the steering wheel. "Hello?" she called out, staggering toward the smoking Maserati. "Can you hear me?" Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and echoing. When she reached the driver's side, her heart stopped. The man was slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. But it wasn't his injuries that froze her in place, it was his face. Even unconscious, even after 13 years, she would recognize him anywhere. The high cheekbones, the strong jaw, the elegant slope of his nose, features that had matured from boyhood but remained unmistakable. Vittorio Kong. The little boy who had grown into the man whose family secrets she had been paid to uncover. The child who had once fallen asleep in her arms, now a man broken and bleeding before her. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "Not you." The rain plastered her hair to her face, mingling with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. But the universe wasn't interested in her protests. The man before her was bleeding, possibly dying. Whatever their past, she couldn't just leave him. The world seemed to narrow to this single point, this moment of choice, as rain pounded the pavement around them. Hands shaking, she pulled out her phone and dialed emergency services. "There's been an accident," she reported in fluent Italian. "We need an ambulance immediately." She gave their location as precisely as she could, describing the severity of the crash, keeping her voice steady despite the panic fluttering in her chest. While waiting for help to arrive, Augine carefully opened his door and pressed her scarf against the wound on his head. His pulse was steady under her fingertips, but he remained unconscious. "Don't die," she murmured. "Please don't die." The words were lost in the sound of rain and distant thunder, but she repeated them like a mantra, a prayer to whoever might be listening. When the ambulance arrived, its siren wailing through the quiet countryside, the paramedics worked quickly and efficiently. Augine rode with him to the hospital, giving the paramedics what little information she could without revealing that she knew him. The ambulance hurtled through the rain-slicked streets of Milan, its lights casting red and blue reflections on wet pavement and building facades. Once they arrived and wheeled him away, she slipped out, leaving only her first name with the nurse at reception. She couldn't be there when he woke up. Couldn't face those eyes that might, with one look, unravel the life she'd carefully built from the ashes of her past. As she walked away from the hospital into the rainy morning, now turning into afternoon, Augine hugged herself against the chill, her clothes still damp from the accident. She had left her car at the crash site, to be dealt with by insurance. Her mind raced with the implications of what had just happened, of who she had just found, and lost, again. But 3 days later, something pulled her back to the hospital. Just to check if he was alive, she told herself. Just to ease her conscience. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. Nurses and doctors moved purposefully through the corridors, their shoes squeaking on the linoleum. She hadn't expected to find him awake, hadn't planned on him seeing her. When those dark eyes had opened, recognition flickering in their depths like distant lightning, she'd panicked and fled. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the hospital corridor, past nurses and visitors who paid her no mind. She burst through the exit doors into the bright afternoon sunlight, gasping as if she'd been underwater. Now, back in her apartment, Augine paced the floor, her carefully controlled world suddenly spinning off its axis. The evening shadows lengthened across her living room as she moved back and forth, her mind replaying the moment his eyes had opened. He had recognized her, she was almost certain of it. But how could he? He had been just a child when she left, and 13 years had passed. She was different now. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, her eyes more guarded. He can't know who I am, she whispered to herself. He can't ever know. The words hung in the air of her apartment, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. For 2 weeks after the accident, Vittorio searched for her. The woman from the hospital room, the same one who, according to the emergency services report, had called for help and accompanied him to the hospital. As his body healed, his mind became increasingly fixated on finding her. The morning after he was released from the hospital, he woke early, determination setting his jaw as he threw back the covers. All he had was a first name, Jean. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He'd hired private investigators, checked hospital security footage, even posted a reward online. Nothing. The woman had vanished as completely as morning mist and sunshine. As days passed and autumn deepened, the leaves in Milan's parks turning golden red, Vittorio's fixation only grew. He found himself scanning crowds, studying the faces of passing women, hoping to glimpse those eyes that had looked at him with such recognition and fear. His obsession puzzled even him. Perhaps it was the concussion, or the brush with mortality, but he couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her had been significant, a cosmic intervention in his high-speed life. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive. If the woman, Jean, hadn't found him when she did, hadn't called for help so quickly, things might have ended very differently. By the 3rd week of his recovery, as October gave way to November and the air took on a sharper chill, Vittorio had almost convinced himself to let it go. Almost. He threw himself back into work, attending meetings, reviewing plans for a new hotel in Barcelona, trying to recapture his old rhythm. But something had shifted inside him. The speed, the risk, the constant motion, none of it satisfied him the way it once had. Until that rainy Tuesday afternoon when, seeking refuge from a sudden downpour, he ducked into a small bookstore cafe in a part of Milan he rarely frequented. The rain had been falling steadily since morning, the sky a uniform gray that showed no sign of clearing. Vittorio had been walking from a business lunch to his office when the heavens opened, sending pedestrians scurrying for cover. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered, shaking rainwater from his coat. The store was cozy, shelves lined with books in multiple languages, the scent of coffee and old paper hanging in the air. A few patrons sat at small tables, reading or typing on laptops. The rain drummed against the windows, creating a soothing background rhythm. And then he saw her. She stood behind the counter, arranging a display of new releases, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a blue cardigan over a white blouse, so different from the blurry figure in his hospital memories, yet unmistakably the same. The afternoon light, muted by rain clouds, cast a soft glow around her, highlighting the graceful movement of her hands as she arranged books. His heart thudded against his ribs, a sudden certainty filling him. It was her. After weeks of searching, he had found her through pure chance, or perhaps something more like destiny. Jean, he said, the name falling from his lips before he could stop himself. The sound carried across the quiet shop, drawing the attention of a few customers before reaching her. Her head snapped up, eyes widening in recognition and, was that fear? She froze, a book still clutched in her hands, her posture suddenly tense like a deer sensing danger. I've been looking for you, Vittorio continued, approaching the counter. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the wooden floor. You saved my life. Jean's carefully built walls threatened to crumble. Here he was, Vittorio Kong, standing in her bookstore, looking at her with those intense eyes that had once, long ago, asked her to stay when his nightmares came. The boy had grown into a strikingly handsome man, his features sharpened by maturity. The same eyes, though, dark and penetrating, as if they could see straight through her defenses. I think you're mistaking me for someone else, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. She set down the book she'd been holding, her fingers lingering on its spine as if drawing strength from its solidity. I'm not, he insisted, studying her face. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows, isolating them in a pocket of warmth and tension. You were at the hospital. After the accident. I was just doing what anyone would do, she replied, desperately searching for an escape route. A shelf that needed arranging, a customer who needed help, anything to break the intensity of his gaze. It wasn't a big deal. Vittorio placed his hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly. It was to me. His voice was lower now, meant only for her ears. A drop of rainwater fell from his hair onto the polished wood between them. A customer approached with a book to purchase, providing Jean with a momentary reprieve. She rang up the sale with mechanical efficiency, hyper-aware of Vittorio's gaze on her. The customer, an elderly woman with kind eyes, thanked her and left, the bell chiming cheerfully as the door closed behind her. The rain continued its steady percussion, marking the passage of time as Augine and Vittorio regarded each other across the counter. When the customer left, he was still there, now settled at a small table with a clear view of the counter. He'd ordered a coffee from her assistant and sat watching her with the patience of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. Outside, the afternoon deepened toward evening, the rain showing no sign of letting up. Shadows lengthened across the store, and Augine moved around turning on lamps, their warm glow creating islands of light in the growing darkness. "Your full name," he said when she finally approached his table to clear away his empty cup. The cup rattled slightly on the saucer as she lifted it, betraying the tremor in her hands. "Please." Augine hesitated. She could lie, but something told her he would discover the truth regardless. The moment stretched between them, filled with the sound of rain and distant traffic and the turning of pages from other patrons. "Lee Augine." "Augine," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Korean?" She nodded stiffly, feeling as if each admission was a step toward some precipice she couldn't yet see. What a coincidence. "So am I." His smile was disarming, dimples appearing on either side of his mouth. The lamplight caught in his dark eyes, making them gleam with warmth and curiosity. "Vittorio Kong." "I know who you are," she said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with more meaning than she'd intended. His eyebrow arched with interest. "Do you? Your face is on business magazines," she recovered quickly, gesturing vaguely toward the rack of periodicals near the door. "The hotel magnate, right?" "Right." He studied her with newfound curiosity, his gaze moving over her face as if memorizing every detail. "Have dinner with me tonight." It wasn't a question but a statement, delivered with the confidence of someone unused to rejection. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, the heavy downpour giving way to a gentle patter against the windows. "I can't." The words were automatic, a shield raised in self-defense. "Tomorrow then." He wasn't deterred, his expression showing the same determination she imagined he brought to business negotiations. "Mr. Kong," Vittorio. Augine sighed, frustration building. "I don't date customers." She set his empty cup down with more force than necessary, the clink of porcelain against wood punctuating her refusal. "Then I'll buy every book in this shop, and I won't be a customer anymore." His eyes twinkled with mischief, the afternoon light catching the golden flecks in his dark irises. Problem solved. Despite herself, a small laugh escaped her. "That's not how it works." The tension between them eased slightly, like the clearing of storm clouds. "It could." He leaned back in his chair, utterly self-assured. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent that follows a storm. "One dinner, Augine. To thank you properly for saving my life. What's the worst that could happen?" "Everything," she thought. "You could remember me. You could discover why I was really in your house all those years ago. You could destroy the life I've built." The thoughts raced through her mind, each more alarming than the last. "One dinner," she heard herself saying instead, the words surprising her as much as him. "That's all?" His smile was triumphant. "I'll pick you up at 8. As he walked out of the bookstore, leaving his card with her number scrawled on the back, Augine knew she'd just made a terrible mistake. But something stronger than logic pulled her toward him, perhaps the same gravity that had brought him into her store on this rainy afternoon after 13 years apart. The bell chimed as the door closed behind him, leaving her alone with decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Some collisions, it seemed, were inevitable. As the day faded into evening, the sky clearing to reveal the first stars, Augine closed the bookstore with trembling hands. What had she done? What had she agreed to? And more importantly, where would it lead? Vittorio arrived precisely at 8, as promised. In the hours between his departure from the bookstore and his arrival at her door, Augine had spent an hour convincing herself to cancel, another hour deciding what to wear, and the final 30 minutes pacing her apartment in the simple black dress she'd finally selected. The evening had turned chilly after the rain, the stars unusually bright in the washed-clean sky. When the buzzer rang, her stomach knotted with anxiety. "I'll be right down," she said into the intercom, her voice higher than usual. "I'll come up," he countered, his deep voice crackling through the speaker. "Apartment 3B, right?" Before she could protest, he was making his way up. Augine took a deep breath, wondering how he knew her apartment number, then remembered she'd filled it out on the accident report. Of course he'd have checked. She smoothed her dress, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, tried to calm her racing heart as footsteps approached her door. The knock on her door was confident, like everything else about him. When she opened it, Vittorio stood there in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a single white rose in hand. The hallway light caught in his dark hair, highlighting threads of deep brown among the black. His cologne, subtle and masculine, reached her before he spoke. "For you," he said, extending the flower. "Though it pales in comparison." His smile was warm, his eyes appraising her with undisguised appreciation. Thank you. She accepted it cautiously, as if it might burn her fingers. The rose was perfect, just beginning to open, its petals velvety against her skin. Give me a moment to put it in water. He waited in the doorway, respectfully not entering without invitation, but his eyes scanned her small apartment with interest. The space was warm and inviting, walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable furniture in muted colors, a few carefully chosen art pieces. It spoke of someone with taste but limited means, someone who valued comfort over ostentation. You have a lot of books, he observed, nodding toward her overstuffed shelves. Evening light filtered through her curtains, casting a golden glow over the spines of hundreds of volumes arranged by genre and language. I own a bookstore. She moved to the kitchen, filling a slim vase with water. These aren't inventory, he said, nodding toward her shelves. These are loved. His fingers traced the spine of a well-worn copy of The Little Prince in the original French. Something about the perceptiveness of his comment caught her off guard. Yes, they are. She placed the rose in the vase, arranging it carefully, aware of his gaze following her movements. Ready? He asked as she returned, grabbing her coat and purse from the hook by the door. Ajin nodded, locking her apartment behind them. Where are we going? Somewhere special. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back as they descended the stairs, the warmth of his touch seeping through the thin material of her dress. She had expected some exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant, the kind frequented by Milan's elite. Instead, Vittorio's sleek Bentley, his Maserati apparently still in repair, stopped before a small, unassuming trattoria tucked away on a quiet street in the old quarter. The evening air was crisp with approaching winter, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. This place has the best risotto in all of Italy, he said as he opened her door. And virtually no chance of paparazzi, which I thought you might appreciate. He offered his arm, which she took after only a moment's hesitation. The thoughtfulness of his choice surprised her. How do you know about this place? It's hardly the haunt of corporate executives. The restaurant was small and intimate, its exterior humble but inviting with flowers in window boxes and warm light spilling onto the cobblestone street. He smiled enigmatically as they entered. I make it my business to know the hidden gems of every city I visit. His hand returned to the small of her back, guiding her through the door. The gesture was proprietary but not presumptuous, confident but not controlling. The restaurant owner greeted Vittorio like an old friend, embracing him and chattering in rapid Italian before leading them to a secluded table in the corner, beneath a trellis of fairy lights and climbing vines. The restaurant was quiet, only a few other tables occupied, creating an atmosphere of privacy without isolation. Once they were settled with wine and bread, Vittorio leaned forward, his dark eyes intent on hers. Tell me about yourself, Liajin. The candlelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong angles of his cheekbones and jaw. She tensed. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the questions that would require either lies or dangerous truths. The wine glass felt cool against her fingers as she lifted it, buying time. Not much to tell, she replied lightly. I moved to Italy about 10 years ago, worked in various bookstores, saved enough to open my own 3 years back. She kept her tone casual, as if recounting something mundane rather than a carefully constructed life built from the ruins of her past. And before Italy? The question was gentle but direct, his gaze never leaving her face. Ajin took a sip of wine, the rich red liquid warming her throat. South Korea, obviously. Seoul? The half-truth hung between them, a partial bridge over the chasm of her past. Family? His fingers broke a piece of bread, but he didn't eat it, his attention fully focused on her. None to speak of. The words were clipped, the door to that conversation firmly closed. Vittorio tilted his head, studying her. Everyone has family. His tone was curious rather than challenging, but the question prodded at wounds she kept carefully bandaged. Not everyone has family worth mentioning, she countered, a sudden edge to her voice. The candlelight flickered between them, shadows dancing across the table. He nodded slowly, recognizing the boundaries she'd drawn. Fair enough. What made you choose books? The shift in topic was graceful, allowing her to breathe more easily. On safer ground now, Ajin relaxed slightly. Books are honest. They tell you exactly what they are from the first page. No surprises, no betrayals. She ran her finger along the stem of her wine glass, watching the play of light through the crystal. Spoken like someone who's been betrayed. His observation was quiet but penetrating, cutting through her defenses with surgical precision. Their eyes met across the table, hers guarded, his perceptive. The sounds of the restaurant, quiet conversations, the clink of glasses, soft music, seemed to fade, leaving them in a bubble of intimacy that both comforted and alarmed her. Unlike people, she continued, ignoring his observation, books can't hide their true nature. A tragedy remains a tragedy, a romance keeps its promises. She broke off a piece of bread, more for something to do with her hands than from hunger. And which do you prefer, tragedies or romances? His smile was gentle, inviting confidence rather than demanding it. Mysteries, she replied with a small smile, the tension between them easing slightly. You never know what's going to happen until the final page. Vittorio laughed, a genuine, warm sound that transformed his face from merely handsome to breathtaking. Somehow that doesn't surprise me. You're something of a mystery yourself. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a detail she found herself noticing and filing away. The waiter arrived with their risotto, momentarily saving Augine from having to respond. The rich aroma of saffron and white wine rose from the plates, making her realize how hungry she actually was. As they ate, the conversation shifted to safer topics, books they'd read, places in Milan they both enjoyed, the unseasonably rainy autumn. Vittorio, she discovered, was as intelligent as he was charming. He spoke knowledgeably about literature, art, and music. This was not the spoiled chaebol heir she had expected, nor the ruthless businessman from magazine profiles. He quoted Dante in perfect Italian, discussed the merits of various translations of Russian novels, and showed genuine interest in her opinions. You're surprised, he noted, catching her appraising look as the evening progressed and their plates were cleared, replaced by small cups of espresso. The restaurant had emptied somewhat, the remaining patrons creating a soft backdrop of conversation and occasional laughter. I am, she admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. You're not what I expected. And what did you expect? He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with amused curiosity. Someone more? She searched for words that wouldn't offend. Arrogant? Shallow? Self-absorbed? He supplied, his smile self-deprecating. The candlelight softened his features, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. Yes, she said honestly. All of those things. A clock somewhere in the restaurant chimed 10, marking the passage of time that had somehow slipped away unnoticed. He laughed again. I can be all those things and worse. But not tonight. His expression grew more serious, his eyes holding hers. Not with you. The way he looked at her sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest. This was dangerous territory. The evening had grown late, the restaurant nearly empty now. Through the windows, she could see the moon rising over the rooftops of Milan, casting silver light on ancient stones. Why did you really want to have dinner with me, Vittorio? She asked directly. You don't owe me anything for the accident. It was just human decency. Because I can't stop thinking about you, he answered, his candor surprising her. From the moment I saw you in the hospital doorway, I felt. He paused, searching for the right words. I felt like I knew you. Like we'd met before. Augine's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Her fingers tightened around the espresso cup, seeking its grounding warmth. That's just the concussion talking, she managed, forcing a light tone. Maybe. He wasn't convinced. Or maybe it's something else. Fate. Destiny. Whatever you want to call it. His voice had dropped lower, intimate in the quiet restaurant. I don't believe in fate, she said firmly, setting down her cup with finality. The sound of it hitting the saucer was too loud in the hushed atmosphere. What do you believe in, Augine? His question was simple but profound, his eyes never leaving hers. Consequences, she thought. I believe that every action has consequences that follow you forever. The weight of her past pressed down on her, a constant companion she could never fully escape. But aloud she said, I believe in making your own path. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, but Vittorio nodded as if they made perfect sense. As do I, he agreed. So here I am, making mine. And right now, that path leads to you. He signaled for the check, the evening drawing to its inevitable close. After dinner, they walked along the Navigli canals, the water reflecting the twinkling lights of the restaurants and bars lining the waterway. The air had grown colder, their breath visible in small clouds as they spoke. Despite her reservations, Augine found herself enjoying his company. Vittorio had an easy way about him that made conversation flow naturally. Can I ask you something personal? He said as they paused on a small footbridge. Below them, the dark water flowed gently, carrying fallen leaves toward some distant destination. Augine tensed. You can ask. I might not answer. She gripped the railing of the bridge, its cold metal grounding her against the warmth of his presence beside her. Fair enough. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Why did you run from the hospital? Why didn't you want me to find you? She looked away, watching the ripples in the dark water below. A boat passed beneath them, its motor a soft purr in the quiet night. I don't like hospitals. Or attention. The half-truth settled between them like frost. There's more to it than that. It wasn't a question but a statement, his perception cutting through her evasion. There isn't, she insisted, meeting his gaze steadily. Her breath formed a small cloud in the cold air, disappearing as quickly as it formed. Vittorio studied her face for a long moment, then nodded, accepting her answer even if he didn't believe it. Whatever your reasons, I'm glad I found you again. His hand moved to cover hers on the railing, warm against her cold fingers. As they returned to his car, Vittorio's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned before silencing it. The device continued to glow for a moment before darkening, casting brief shadows across his face. Not going to answer that? Ajin asked, grateful for the distraction from the tension building between them. It's my father, he replied, his jaw tightening. He can wait. He pocketed the phone, his movements suddenly brusque, the easy charm momentarily replaced by something harder. Not close? She stepped into the car as he held the door, the interior warm and smelling of leather and his cologne. Vittorio laughed without humor as he slid into the driver's seat. You could say that. My father has spent most of my life trying to mold me into his idea of a perfect son. When that failed, he tried to buy my compliance. When that failed, he shrugged, starting the engine. Let's just say we have different ideas about family loyalty. The irony of this conversation wasn't lost on Ajin. Here she was, the person once hired to spy on his family, listening to him confide about the very relationships she had been paid to document. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across his face as they drove, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. Family is complicated, she offered neutrally, watching the familiar streets of Milan pass by, the city different at night, more mysterious, more romantic. That's diplomatic, he remarked with a sideways glance. Most people just tell me to make peace with him before it's too late. People who dispense easy advice about family usually have simple families. The words came from somewhere deep within her, a truth she rarely acknowledged even to herself. And yours isn't simple? The question hung in the air between them as they stopped at a traffic light. Red illumination bathed his profile, emphasizing the strong line of his nose, the set of his mouth. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. The light changed to green, and they moved forward, the moment passing like the changing of the light. The past tense hung between them, but Vittorio didn't press further. The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts as the car glided through the nighttime streets of Milan. The city slept around them, lights and windows going dark one by one as the hour grew later. When they reached her apartment building, he walked her to the entrance. The night had grown colder, their breath forming small clouds in the air between them. The street was quiet, most of its residents already asleep. Thank you for tonight, she said formally, fishing for her keys. The metal was cold against her fingers as she extracted them from her purse. Have dinner with me again tomorrow, he said, not a question but not quite a command either. His eyes held hers, dark and intense in the yellow glow of the street lamp. Ajin shook her head. I can't. I have inventory to do at the store. The excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. The day after, then. He wasn't deterred, his persistence both flattering and alarming. Vittorio, she began to protest, but he cut her off gently. I'm not giving up easily, Ajin. His smile was determined but gentle. That's your first warning. He reached out, adjusting the collar of her coat where it had folded inward, his fingers brushing against her neck in a touch so brief she might have imagined it. Despite herself, she smiled back. Good night, Mr. Kong. She unlocked the door, stepping into the warm entryway of her building. Good night, Ms. Lee. He remained on the sidewalk, waiting until she was safely inside before turning to leave. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Ajin tried to ignore the warmth spreading through her chest. One dinner, she had promised herself. Just one. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, the building settling into nighttime quiet around her. But even as she made that promise, she knew it was already broken. The key turned in her lock, the door opening to her silent apartment. She leaned against it after closing it behind her, heart still racing from the evening, from him, from the dangerous game she had just begun to play. Over the next few weeks, Vittorio became a fixture at the bookstore. He would arrive most afternoons, sometimes purchasing books, sometimes just sitting in a corner with his laptop, occasionally glancing up to watch her work. The autumn days grew shorter, sunlight slanting through the bookstore windows at increasingly lower angles as November deepened toward December. The streets of Milan began to show signs of the approaching holidays, subtle decorations appearing in shop windows, a festive atmosphere building gradually. At first, Ajin tried to maintain her distance, but his persistence wore down her defenses. Small conversations led to shared coffee breaks, which evolved into regular dinners and weekend outings. The weather grew colder, forcing them indoors more often, creating an unexpected intimacy as they shared warm drinks and long conversations by fireplaces or in cozy cafes. Vittorio showed her a Milan she had never known despite living there for years, hidden gardens, ancient courtyards, tiny restaurants tucked away in forgotten corners. He took her to art exhibitions, outdoor concerts, and once, memorably, to a vintage car show where he spoke passionately about engines and aerodynamics. His excitement was contagious, his knowledge impressive, and Ajin found herself smiling more than she had in years. In turn, Ajin introduced him to the simpler pleasures of her world: farmers' markets on Sunday mornings, a hidden bakery that made the best cannoli in the city, the quiet joy of reading in the park as autumn leaves swirled around them. They discovered a shared love of obscure foreign films, spending one rainy Saturday at a small independent theater watching a Polish director's latest release, arguing good-naturedly about its meaning over wine afterward. "I've never done this before," Vittorio admitted one afternoon as they sat on a bench in Sempione Park, sharing a bag of roasted chestnuts. The day was cold but clear, the winter sun casting long shadows across the paths where people walked bundled in coats and scarves. "Eaten chestnuts?" she teased, nudging him with her shoulder. Their breath formed small clouds in the chilly air, mingling between them. "No." He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Slowed down. Been present." He cracked open another chestnut, the shell breaking with a satisfying snap between his strong fingers. Ajin studied him, struck by the vulnerability in his admission. "Why do you live so fast?" "The racing, the parties, the constant movement." "What are you running from?" The question was direct, perhaps too direct, crossing the careful boundaries they'd established. Vittorio was quiet for a long moment, rolling a chestnut between his fingers. A child laughed somewhere nearby, the sound carrying across the park. An old man walked his dog along the path before them, the animal stopping to investigate interesting smells in the grass. "Silence, I think," he finally said. "When everything is quiet, when I'm alone with my thoughts." He shook his head. "I don't like who I am in the silence." The admission cost him something, she could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the slight downturn of his mouth. "I think you're afraid of who you could be," she said softly. "Not who you are." Her words were quiet but carried clearly in the still winter air. He looked at her, surprised by her insight. "And who could I be?" The question held genuine curiosity, as if her answer mattered deeply. "Someone free," she replied simply. "Someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as a cold breeze swept through the park, rustling bare branches above them. Vittorio reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "When I'm with you, I feel closer to being that person." The warmth of his touch contrasted with the cold air, a small pocket of heat between them. The sincerity in his words both warmed and terrified her. She was falling for him, had been falling since that first dinner, and each day that passed without telling him the truth made her deception worse. As the park began to empty, people heading home for warmth and dinner, Ajin and Vittorio remained on their bench, hands linked, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. But every time she resolved to confess, to tell him about her past connection to his family, something stopped her. Fear, certainly. But also the selfish desire to preserve what they were building, this delicate, beautiful thing that made her happier than she'd been in years. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder, and with each passing week, she found more reasons to postpone the inevitable truth. One rainy evening, they sat in her apartment after dinner, a bottle of wine half empty between them. The rain tapped against the windows, a soothing counterpoint to the crackling of the small fire in her rarely used fireplace. Vittorio had insisted on cooking for her, and to her surprise, he was quite skilled in the kitchen. The remains of their meal, a perfectly executed risotto, still sat on the table, forgotten as they relaxed on her sofa. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" she asked, curled up beside him on her small sofa. The wine had left her pleasantly warm, more relaxed than usual in his presence. "My grandmother taught me," he replied, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. She believed every man should know how to make at least 3 dishes perfectly. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her arm, each touch sending small shivers through her. "And what are your 3? She nestled closer, drawn to his warmth, his scent, the solid presence of him beside her. "Bibimbap, because I'm Korean and she would disown me if I couldn't make it. Risotto alla Milanese, because I live in Italy. And chocolate soufflé, because it impresses women." He winked at her, the firelight casting dramatic shadows across his handsome face. Ajin laughed, leaning into him. "Your grandmother sounds wonderful." The rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof and windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. "She was," he said softly. "She practically raised me after my parents divorced. My mother was not well, and my father was always working." His voice grew quieter, touched with old pain. The fire popped in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney. "Was?" she asked tentatively, aware she was treading on sensitive ground. Her hand found his, fingers interlacing in silent support. "She died 5 years ago." His voice grew distant, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. "The last thing she made me promise was to reconcile with my father before it was too late." He gave a hollow laugh. "I'm not doing a very good job of keeping that promise." He took another sip of wine, the liquid catching the firelight as it moved in the glass. Ajin thought of her own grandmother, not a biological relation, but the elderly housekeeper who had looked after her when she was young, before everything fell apart. The woman who had taught her to read, to value books and stories. The memory was bittersweet, a rare unguarded moment from her past. "What about you?" Vittorio asked, his hand gently tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "You never talk about your family." The question was inevitable, had been coming for weeks as they grew closer. Ajin tensed, but she'd been expecting this question. Over the weeks, she'd constructed a narrative, not entirely false, but carefully edited. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls of her small living room. "My parents died when I was 14, she said. This much was true. Car accident. Also true, though she omitted that it had been a suicide murder after her father's embezzlement scheme was discovered. I was raised by relatives after that. True again, if you counted being shuttled between distant cousins who viewed her as a burden." The rain continued its steady rhythm, nature's percussion accompanying her carefully constructed truth. "I'm sorry," Vittorio said, pulling her closer. His hand stroked her hair, gentle and comforting. "That explains why you ran into the hospital after our accident, but didn't want to stay. Bad memories." The fire popped again, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. She nodded, grateful for the ready-made explanation. "Yes." The single word hung between them, a bridge too narrow to support the weight of the full truth. His hand stroked her hair gently. "Thank you for telling me." His voice was warm with genuine appreciation for her trust. The guilt twisted inside her like a knife. Here he was, thanking her for a partial truth, while the complete truth remained buried. The rain began to ease outside, its steady drumming softening to a gentle patter against the windows. "Vittorio," she began, gathering her courage. "There's something I need to." His phone rang, interrupting her confession. He sighed, checking the screen. "It's my assistant. I'm sorry, I need to take this. There's a situation with the Bangkok property." His expression shifted instantly from relaxed to focused, the businessman emerging from behind the companion. As he stepped into the kitchen to take the call, Ajin's resolve faltered. Perhaps it was for the best. What good would come from telling him now? It would only cause pain. She watched him through the doorway, his back straight and shoulders tense as he spoke in rapid Italian, his free hand gesturing emphatically. This was a different Vittorio from the one who had been sitting beside her moments ago, efficient, commanding, every inch the powerful CEO. When Vittorio returned, his expression was troubled. "I'm sorry, but I need to go. There's an issue that requires my immediate attention." He began gathering his things, slipping his phone into his pocket, shrugging into his coat. "I understand," she said, rising to walk him to the door. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind that particular stillness that follows a storm. He cupped her face in his hands, his dark eyes intense. "We'll continue this conversation soon." His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, the touch gentle despite the urgency of his departure. Before she could respond, he kissed her, deep and tender, a kiss that spoke of feelings neither had yet put into words. His lips were warm against hers, tasting faintly of wine and the promise of more. "Good night, Ajin," he whispered against her lips before pulling away reluctantly. After he left, she stood in the empty apartment, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. The fire had died down to embers, casting a red glow across the dimming room. Outside, the night was clear after the rain, stars appearing between breaks in the clouds. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, the question echoing in the empty space. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She was falling in love with Vittorio Kong, again, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The holiday season approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere to Milan. Christmas lights adorned the streets, and the Duomo Plaza was transformed with a magnificent tree and market stalls. The air grew colder, occasional snow flurries dancing through the streets before melting on contact with the pavement. Ajin's bookstore saw increased business as people shopped for holiday gifts, keeping her busier than usual during the days. Vittorio surprised Ajin by decorating her bookstore one morning before opening, filling it with subtle holiday touches, tasteful garlands, tiny white lights, and a small tree in the reading corner. The smell of pine mingled with the familiar scent of books and coffee, creating a cozy atmosphere that delighted customers and staff alike. "You didn't have to do this," she said, though she was clearly touched. She ran her fingers along a strand of lights, admiring the way they twinkled against the dark wood of the bookshelves. "I wanted to," he replied, kissing her cheek. "Besides, it's good for business. Holiday spirit encourages purchases." His practical reasoning was belied by the boyish pride in his eyes as he watched her reaction. She laughed, shaking her head at his businessman's logic. Always the entrepreneur. Outside, snow began to fall again, large flakes visible through the bookstore windows, adding to the festive atmosphere. Speaking of business, he said casually, perching on the counter. I have to go to Korea next week. Come with me. The invitation was delivered lightly, but his eyes watched her carefully for her reaction. Ajin froze, her hand halfway through arranging a display of Christmas-themed books. What? The single word came out sharper than she intended, drawing curious glances from a few early customers. Come to Seoul with me, he repeated. It's a short trip, 4 days. I have meetings, but we'd have evenings together. I could show you my hometown. Snow continued to fall outside, accumulating on windowsills and street signs. I can't just leave the store, she stammered, her mind racing through possible excuses. It's our busiest season, Elena can handle it, he countered, referring to her assistant. She's been here almost as long as you have. He slid off the counter, moving closer to her, his expression earnest. She's more than capable. It's not that I don't trust Elena, it's just, Ajin struggled to find reasons that wouldn't reveal her panic at the thought of returning to Seoul, to the scene of her greatest shame. Ajin. He took her hands, his expression earnest. I want you to meet my father. Her blood turned to ice. Your father? The two words emerged strangled, barely audible over the gentle Christmas music playing in the background. Yes. It's time. I've been thinking about what you said, about being afraid of who I could be. His eyes were bright with determination, his hands warm around hers. I want to try to make peace with him. And I want you there with me. The irony was almost too much to bear. Her, the former spy, being introduced to Jin Wukong as his son's girlfriend. The man would certainly remember her face, even after 13 years. The memory of his cold fury when he discovered her notebook was still vivid, a nightmare that occasionally still woke her in a cold sweat. Vittorio, I don't think that's a good idea, she said carefully, extracting her hands from his. Family reconciliations should be private. You don't need me there. She busied herself with the book display, avoiding his gaze. But I want you there, he insisted, stepping closer again. You give me strength, Ajin. When I'm with you, I feel like I can be better, like I want to be better. He reached for her again, turning her to face him. Please. Say yes. The hope in his eyes was her undoing. Snow fell heavier outside, blanketing Milan in white silence. Let me think about it, she said finally, unable to crush his hope outright. He beamed, taking her response as an eventual yes. Perfect. I'll have my assistant book a ticket just in case. He kissed her quickly, excitement evident in his movements as he headed for the door. I have meetings this afternoon, but I'll call you later. That evening, alone in her apartment, Ajin paced anxiously. Going to Korea was impossible. Jin Wukong would recognize her immediately, and everything would unravel. The snow had stopped, leaving Milan transformed and unfamiliar under its white blanket. Streetlights reflected off the snow, casting an ethereal glow through her windows. But refusing would raise too many questions, questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She was trapped in a web of her own making, each lie leading to another, each evasion boxing her in further. Sooner or later, the truth would emerge. The only question was whether she would control the revelation or if fate would do it for her. She made tea she didn't drink, picked up books she didn't read, turned on music she didn't hear. Outside, the city grew quiet under its snowy covering, the usual traffic sounds muffled by the white blanket that transformed Milan into something from a fairy tale. The next day, Vittorio arrived at the bookstore with coffee and pastries, his expression unusually somber. Ajin felt a flutter of anxiety as he approached the counter, his movements lacking their usual confident energy. What's wrong? Ajin asked immediately, taking the coffee he offered. The store was quiet, most Milanese choosing to stay home in the aftermath of the snowfall. Change of plans, he said, setting down the coffee tray. My father is coming to Milan instead. Her heart skipped a beat. Your father? Here? When? Each question emerged higher pitched than the last, panic rising like floodwater. Tomorrow. Vittorio ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she rarely saw from him. He's insisting on meeting me to discuss some family business matter. He'll be here for 3 days. He sighed heavily, oblivious to her growing distress. I was just getting used to the idea of going back to Seoul. Well, that's convenient. Now you don't have to travel, Ajin managed, though her mind was racing. Jin Wukong in Milan. In less than 24 hours. She needed to disappear, to call in sick, to find some excuse to avoid any possibility of an encounter. Yes, but it means I'll have less control over the situation. He sighed heavily. My father in Milan, during the holidays? It's a recipe for disaster. He took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the temperature or the taste or perhaps the situation itself. I'm sure it will be fine, she said automatically, though her own panic was mounting. She wiped her suddenly damp palms on her jeans, hoping he wouldn't notice her distress. I want him to meet you, Vittorio continued, oblivious to her distress. Dinner tomorrow night? Nothing fancy, just the three of us. Tomorrow? She repeated weakly. I'm not sure if, please, Augine. He reached for her hand across the counter. I've never introduced anyone to my father before. This is important to me. His thumb stroked across her knuckles, the touch both comforting and terrifying in its implications. Looking into his hopeful eyes, Augine knew she was cornered. Okay, she heard herself say. Tomorrow. The word felt like a death sentence, but she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. After Vittorio left, she collapsed into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Jin Wukong was coming to Milan. And she had 24 hours to decide whether to meet him and face the consequences, or disappear from Vittorio's life forever. Outside, the snow began to melt, dripping from rooftops and trees, the pristine white giving way to messy reality, much like the careful facade of her life. That night, she barely slept, tossing and turning as memories flooded back, memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. The sheets tangled around her legs as she struggled against nightmares both old and new, the past and present colliding in her unconscious mind. By morning, dark circles shadowed her eyes, her movements sluggish from exhaustion as she prepared for what felt like an execution. She had been 16, desperate and alone after her parents' deaths, when the man had approached her. The memory was clear despite the years, Park Do-hyun in his expensive suit, his cold smile, his promises of security when she had nothing. He'd offered her a job, a place to stay, a purpose. All she had to do was become a live-in tutor and companion for a young boy in a wealthy family, and report back on the family's activities. It had seemed so simple then. She hadn't understood she was being used as a spy, hadn't realized she was a pawn in a corporate power struggle. By the time she discovered the truth, that Park was trying to gather dirt on Jin Wukong to force a business takeover, she had already grown attached to the little boy in her care. Vittorio. When she'd tried to back out, Park had threatened to expose her parents' sordid past, her father's crimes, her mother's complicity. She'd been trapped, feeding him trivial information while trying to protect the family she'd come to care for. The guilt of those months still weighed on her, a burden she had carried across oceans and years. Until the day Jin Woo had discovered her journal, filled with notes about family schedules, business visitors, and private conversations. The memory made her physically ill, his cold fury, his disgust, his immediate dismissal. She'd been terminated immediately, and Park had abandoned her, cutting all ties and leaving her to fend for herself. She'd fled to Italy, terrified of the consequences, carrying only the guilt of her betrayal and the memory of a little boy asking why his favorite tutor had disappeared without saying goodbye. And now, 13 years later, the past she'd outrun was about to catch up with her. All because she'd failed to drive away from an accident scene, failed to resist the pull she'd always felt toward the sad-eyed boy who'd grown into the man she was falling in love with. Morning light filtered through her bedroom curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Outside, Milan awakened, people returning to their routines after the snow day. Life continued, regardless of her personal crisis. She had decisions to make, a future to shape or destroy. By morning, Augine had made her decision. She couldn't run again. Whatever the consequences, she owed Vittorio the truth. She would go to dinner, face Jin Wukong, and afterward, tell Vittorio everything, who she really was, what she'd done, and why she'd been afraid to tell him. The certainty of this decision brought a strange calm, like the eye of a hurricane. She would lose him, certainly. But continuing the deception would only lead to greater pain for them both. Better to face the consequences of her actions than to live in fear of discovery. Better to lose him on her terms than to have him torn away when the truth inevitably emerged. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Every customer at the bookstore seemed to move in slow motion, every transaction taking twice as long as usual. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second bringing her closer to the moment of reckoning. By closing time, Augine's nerves were stretched to breaking point, her smile fixed and brittle as she bid the last customer goodbye. She dressed carefully for dinner, a simple navy blue dress, pearl earrings, minimal makeup. As she fastened the clasp of a slender silver bracelet, a gift from Vittorio on her birthday, her phone buzzed with a text. The bright screen illuminated her dimly lit bedroom, casting sharp shadows. "Car will pick you up at 7. Can't wait to see you." Be the message, so normal, so affectionate, made her heart ache. By this time tomorrow, those messages would stop. This relationship they had built, this happiness she had found, it would all be over. She looked at herself one last time in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back, a woman about to lose everything for the second time in her life. The restaurant Vittorio had chosen was upscale but not ostentatious, a place known for its excellent food rather than its celebrity clientele. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting lazily through the golden light of street lamps as the car approached the entrance. Ajin took a deep, steadying breath, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the door handle. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "For him." The words hung in the cold air of the car, a promise and a prayer. The maitre d' led her to a private dining area in the back of the restaurant, his shoes silent on the thick carpet. The space was elegantly appointed, soft lighting creating an intimate atmosphere despite its size. Vittorio was already there, pacing nervously. When he saw her, his face lit up, a genuine smile transforming his features. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek. His cologne enveloped her, familiar and comforting. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean into him, to memorize the feeling of his solid presence. "Is your father here yet?" she asked, scanning the room. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high, too tight. "No, but he should arrive any minute." Vittorio straightened his tie, another nervous gesture. "Are you okay? You seem tense." His eyes searched hers, concern evident in his expression. "Just nervous about meeting your father," she replied, which wasn't entirely a lie. The knot in her stomach tightened as she spoke, her hands cold despite the warmth of the room. "Don't be. He can be intimidating, but once he sees how happy you make me, he'll love you." His confidence was touching and heartbreaking all at once. Ajin doubted that very much, but she managed a weak smile. The minutes stretched into eternity as they waited, making small talk that neither would remember later. Vittorio ordered wine that Ajin barely tasted, her throat too tight to swallow properly. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Jin Wukong had arrived, flanked by two assistants who peeled away as he approached the private dining room. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to command, his expensive suit impeccably tailored, his posture ramrod straight despite his age. Ajin's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Jin Woo looked older than she remembered, his hair now salt and pepper, lines etched more deeply around his eyes and mouth, but he carried himself with the same commanding presence that had once terrified a 16-year-old girl caught in circumstances beyond her control. "Father," Vittorio greeted him, bowing slightly in the traditional Korean manner despite their Italian surroundings. There was a stiffness to his movements, a formality that hadn't been present moments before. "Vittorio," Jin Woo replied, his voice just as Ajin remembered it, deep and authoritative. "You're looking well." His gaze moved past his son, scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. His eyes shifted to Ajin, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned. His expression froze, then darkened with shock and anger. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. "You," he said, the single word loaded with 13 years of suspicion. He took a half step back, as if physically recoiling from her presence. Vittorio glanced between them, confusion evident. "You know each other?" His question hung in the air, unanswered as the two regarded each other, Jin Woo with cold fury, Ajin with resignation. Before either could respond, a fourth person entered the private dining room, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and cold eyes. Ajin's blood ran cold as she recognized him immediately. The room seemed to tilt beneath her feet, reality becoming unstable. Park Do-hyun. The man who had hired her to spy on the Kong family. The man who had abandoned her when she was caught. The man who had set in motion the events that had defined the course of her life. He looked much the same as he had 13 years ago, perhaps a bit grayer, a bit more lined, but still radiating that same cold authority, that same calculating intelligence. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Park said smoothly in Korean, his gaze locked on Ajin. "But when I heard Jin Woo was meeting his son and a special guest, I couldn't resist joining." His smile was like a knife, sharp, cold, dangerous. "Do-hyun," Jin Woo said stiffly. "This is a private dinner." The tension between the two men was palpable, electricity crackling in the air between them. "Oh, but I think my presence is quite relevant," Park replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Especially given who your son has brought to dinner." He shifted his gaze to Vittorio, appraising him with the cool assessment of a collector viewing a potential acquisition. Vittorio looked more confused than ever, his usual confidence faltering in the face of this unexpected turn of events. "What's going on? Who is this man?" He looked between his father and Park, then to Ajin, seeking answers from any quarter. "An old business associate," Jin Woo said tersely. "Who was just leaving." His emphasis on the last word was unmistakable, a command rather than a suggestion. Park ignored him, focusing on Ajin. "It's been a long time, hasn't it? 13 years, I believe. You've grown up." His words were cordial, but his tone held a subtle malice that made Ajin's skin crawl. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier, charged with unspoken accusations and old enmities. The soft lighting that had seemed intimate now felt theatrical, spotlighting a drama no one had rehearsed. "Will someone please explain what's happening?" Vittorio demanded, his patience evaporating. His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. Park's smile widened. Ask your girlfriend. Or should I say, your former childhood spy? The words were softly spoken but landed with the impact of a bomb detonating. The room went silent. Jean felt the blood drain from her face as Vittorio turned to her, his expression a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. The moment she had dreaded for months had arrived, orchestrated by the man who had set her on this path 13 years ago. Spy? Vittorio repeated. What is he talking about? His voice was too controlled, too even, betraying the storm beneath the surface. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. But not like this, not with Park twisting the knife, not in this public setting with all of them watching. She had wanted to tell Vittorio in private, to explain properly, to help him understand. Instead, her secret was being exposed in the most painful way possible. Vittorio, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain, she was planted in your household when you were a child, Park interrupted, clearly enjoying the moment. Hired to report on your father's business dealings, his personal life, anything that might be useful. His eyes gleamed with malice. She was quite good at it, too. Until she got caught. Vittorio looked as though he'd been struck. His gaze moved from Park to his father, seeking confirmation, then finally settled on Jean. The confusion in his eyes was rapidly giving way to understanding, and with it, betrayal. Is this true? He asked, his voice unnaturally calm. The calm before the storm. She couldn't lie anymore. Not now. Not with all of them watching, waiting for her response. The weight of 13 years of secrets pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Yes, she whispered. But it wasn't what you think, wasn't what I think? Vittorio's calm shattered, his voice rising. What exactly do you think I'm thinking, Jean? That the woman I'm falling in love with has been lying to me from the moment we met? That our entire relationship is based on a lie? Each question drove the knife deeper, his pain transforming into anger before her eyes. No. She protested, reaching for him. It wasn't like that. He stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it might burn him. You knew who I was from the beginning. The accident wasn't a coincidence, was it? His accusation hung in the air between them, a bridge neither could cross. The accident was real, she insisted, desperate for him to believe at least this one truth. I had no idea you were in Milan until that day. I swear. Her voice cracked, tears threatening to spill over. But you recognized me, he pressed, his eyes hard. You knew exactly who I was when you found me in that car. She couldn't deny it. Yes. The admission cost her, each truth another nail in the coffin of their relationship. And you said nothing. For months, you said nothing. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the hurt beneath his anger. While I told you my secrets, my fears, He stopped, unable to continue, the pain too raw to articulate. Jean Wu stepped forward, his face a mask of control. Vittorio, we should discuss this privately. No, Vittorio cut him off, his voice sharp. I want to hear from her. I want to know why. He turned back to Jean, his expression a mixture of pain and fury. Was any of it real? Or was this just a continuation of your assignment? The accusation stung like a physical blow. It was real, she said, tears now flowing freely. Everything between us was real. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid I would react exactly like this? He finished for her. You're right to be afraid. Because this, us, whatever it was. He gestured between them. It's over. Without another word, Vittorio strode past her and out of the private dining room, his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the main restaurant. Jean started to follow, but Jean Wu blocked her path, his imposing figure an immovable obstacle. Haven't you done enough damage? He asked coldly. The contempt in his eyes was familiar, a mirror reflecting back the day he had discovered her betrayal 13 years ago. Jean faced him squarely, despite her tears. I never meant to hurt anyone. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, inadequate to express the complexity of her regret. Yet that seems to be what you do best, Jean Wu said dismissively before following his son. His exit left a vacuum in the room, the absence of his commanding presence almost as noticeable as its impact had been. Left alone with Park, Jean wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. The tears continued to fall, beyond her control now, years of guilt and fear finding release in this moment of ultimate loss. Why? She asked simply. Why did you come here tonight? Why ruin this for me? The questions tumbled out, fueled by a lifetime of wondering, of carrying the burden he had placed on her shoulders. Park studied her dispassionately, as if she were an interesting but ultimately insignificant specimen. Call it completing unfinished business. You were a loose end I never quite managed to tie up. He adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture casual, indifferent to the devastation he had just caused. I was 16, she said, anger replacing her sadness. I was alone and desperate, and you used me. Then you abandoned me when things went wrong." Her voice grew stronger with each word, years of suppressed rage finding voice at last. "Business," he replied with a shrug. "Nothing personal." His casual dismissal of her pain only fueled her anger. "It was personal to me," she retorted. "It's been personal for 13 years. She stood straighter, refusing to be diminished by him any longer. Park smiled thinly. "Well, now it's over. Truly over." He turned to leave, then paused. "You know, in a way, you should thank me. Better he learns the truth now than after you've trapped him into marriage." With that parting shot, he walked out, leaving Ah-jin alone in the empty dining room. After he left, Ah-jin remained standing in the empty dining room, the weight of everything that had just happened crushing down on her. In the space of 10 minutes, she had lost Vittorio, exposed her past, and confronted the man who had set her on this path all those years ago. The room, with its elegant furnishings and soft lighting, now seemed to mock her with its pretense of civility. She made her way outside on unsteady legs. Vittorio was gone, his car no longer parked in front of the restaurant. She hadn't really expected him to wait. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped, turning the slush on the sidewalks to treacherous ice. A fitting metaphor, she thought bitterly, for the beautiful thing that had turned dangerous and then shattered. As she walked home through the festively decorated streets of Milan, snowflakes beginning to fall again around her, Ah-jin had never felt more alone. Christmas lights twinkled overhead, couples walked arm in arm, and holiday music drifted from open shop doors, all of it a cruel contrast to the emptiness inside her. Each step took her further from Vittorio, from the happiness she had briefly held, from the future she had begun to imagine might be possible. By the time she reached her apartment, her feet were numb with cold and her face stiff with dried tears. The silence of her home, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. She moved through the dark rooms like a ghost, not bothering to turn on lights, the glow from street lamps outside providing just enough illumination to navigate. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her coat, too drained to even remove it. On her nightstand, a framed photograph caught her eye, she and Vittorio at the vintage car show, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. The happiness in their faces was palpable, a moment of pure joy captured forever. With trembling hands, she laid the frame face down. That chapter of her life was over. She had known from the beginning it would end this way. Had known and had fallen in love anyway, fooling herself into believing that somehow the past could remain buried, that she could outrun the consequences of her actions. For 3 days, Ah-jin heard nothing from Vittorio. He didn't come to the bookstore, didn't call, didn't text. It was as if he had erased her from his life. The world outside continued its march toward Christmas, decorations becoming more elaborate, crowds growing larger in the shopping districts, the air filled with anticipation of the upcoming holiday. She went through the motions of her daily routine, opening the store, helping customers, closing up, but she felt hollow inside. The bookstore, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage set, the familiar surroundings unable to provide their usual comfort. Elena, her assistant, noticed her subdued state but knew better than to pry. She silently took on more responsibilities, covering for Ah-jin when customers asked questions she seemed not to hear, managing the holiday rush with quiet efficiency. On the 4th day, when the store was quiet during the afternoon lull, the bell above the door chimed. Ah-jin looked up from her inventory ledger, her heart leaping momentarily before sinking again when she saw it was Jin Wukong, not his son. He entered like a storm cloud, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere of the cozy bookstore. Dressed in an immaculate dark suit, he looked out of place among the comfortable chairs and crowded shelves. "Mr. Kong," she greeted him formally, bowing slightly out of habit. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down her pen. "What can I do for you?" Jin Woo surveyed the small bookstore with a critical eye before approaching the counter. His gaze took in every detail, assessing, evaluating, as if he were considering a business acquisition rather than visiting a shop. "I came to talk about my son. Is he okay?" Ah-jin asked immediately, her concern genuine. The question escaped before she could contain it, revealing more than she intended about her continued feelings. "No," Jin Woo replied bluntly. "He's hurt, angry, and confused. He's hardly eating or sleeping. He's throwing himself into work and ignoring everything else." There was no accusation in his tone, merely a statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. Guilt washed over her. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I never wanted to hurt him." The admission felt inadequate, a pebble offered in place of a mountain. "Yet you did." Jin Woo's expression remained stern. "I won't pretend I was happy to see you again, Miss Lee. You betrayed my trust once before. But my son's happiness matters more to me than old grudges." Ah-jin blinked in surprise. This wasn't what she had expected from their confrontation. She had anticipated anger, threats, perhaps even some form of retribution. Not this calm, almost pragmatic approach. Vittorio loves you, Jin-woo continued, his tone softening slightly. I've never seen him like this about anyone. The fact that he wanted me to meet you. He shook his head. That's unprecedented. I love him too, she admitted quietly. That's why I agreed to the dinner. I was going to tell him everything afterward. The truth felt strange on her lips after months of careful avoidance. Jin-woo studied her for a long moment. And now that everything is out in the open? What would you say to him if you could? That I'm sorry, she replied without hesitation. That I was young and foolish when I worked for Park. That I didn't understand what I was doing until it was too late. That I never told him because I was afraid of losing him. She swallowed hard. And that everything between us these past months has been real and true. Jin-woo nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with her answer. 13 years ago, I saw you as a threat, a spy who had infiltrated my home and endangered my family. His expression grew thoughtful. But perhaps I judged too harshly. You were a child, manipulated by a man who has made a career of using others. That doesn't excuse what I did, Ah-jin said, surprised by his shift in tone. Outside, snow began to fall again, flakes drifting past the bookstore windows, ghostly dancers in the early winter dusk. No, it doesn't, Jin-woo agreed. But it explains it. He sighed heavily, seeming to age before her eyes. My son is stubborn. He gets that from me. He won't reach out to you on his own. I understand, she said, though the confirmation hurt nonetheless. She began rearranging books on the counter, needing to occupy her hands, to channel her emotions into something physical. But, Jin-woo continued, he might listen if you reached out to him. He pulled a small card from his pocket and placed it on the counter. He's staying at his penthouse. The security code is on the back of this card. Ah-jin stared at the card in confusion, making no move to take it. You're helping me? The question emerged incredulous, disbelieving. I'm helping my son, Jin-woo corrected. Whatever happened in the past, I can see that you care for him. And he cares for you. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Miss Lee. If you hurt him again, there will be consequences. The warning was delivered with the same calm certainty as everything else he had said, but there was no mistaking its seriousness. With that warning hanging in the air, he left the bookstore, the bell chiming cheerfully behind him, incongruously bright against the gravity of his parting words. Ah-jin picked up the card, turning it over in her hands. Why had Jin-woo decided to help her? Perhaps he truly did value his son's happiness above old grievances. Or perhaps, in the years since their last encounter, he had gained perspective on what really mattered. Either way, she now had a choice to make. The card felt heavy in her hand, weighted with possibility and peril in equal measure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming Milan once again, covering the grime and soot with pristine white. That evening, Ah-jin stood outside Vittorio's penthouse building, Jin-woo's card clutched in her hand. The snow had stopped, leaving the city hushed and clean, streetlights creating pools of golden light on the pristine sidewalks. She had closed the bookstore early, gone home to change, and spent an hour trying to find the right words to say. Now, standing before the sleek glass building, she wondered if she was making another mistake. Would Vittorio even want to see her? Or would her presence only cause him more pain? The building rose before her, imposing in its modern elegance, windows reflecting the night sky and city lights. Taking a deep breath, she punched in the security code and entered the lobby. The concierge nodded to her, apparently recognizing her from previous visits. His face betrayed no surprise or judgment, merely professional courtesy. Mr. Kong is in, miss, he said. Shall I announce you? No, she replied quickly. Thank you. I'd like to surprise him. The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't risk Vittorio refusing to see her before she had a chance to speak. The concierge nodded, gesturing toward the elevators. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor seemed endless. With each passing floor, Ah-jin's anxiety mounted. The soft music playing in the elevator seemed absurdly cheerful compared to the storm inside her. What if he refused to listen? What if he had already moved on? The reflection of her pale face in the polished doors stared back at her, offering no reassurance. When the doors finally opened, she stepped out into the private foyer of his penthouse. The door was unlocked, careless for someone so wealthy, but typical of Vittorio's casual approach to security. Or perhaps, she thought with a pang, he simply didn't care anymore whether anyone entered. She hesitated only a moment before knocking. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. When there was no answer, she gently pushed the door open. The penthouse was darkened, only a few lamps providing islands of light in the vast space. Vittorio? She called softly, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the building's heating system. The penthouse was dimly lit, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Milan at night. The city spread out below them, a tapestry of lights against the darkness, beautiful and distant. She moved further inside, through the elegant living room with its minimalist furnishings, toward the soft glow coming from his home office. She found him there, seated behind his desk, focused intently on his laptop screen. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, his jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. An open bottle of whiskey sat beside his computer, a half-empty glass within reach. The room smelled of alcohol and coffee and the faint trace of his cologne. He hadn't noticed her yet, and Ajin took a moment to gather her courage. He looked different, harder, older, the relaxed man who had cooked risotto in her kitchen now replaced by someone guarded and weary. The transformation was her doing, she knew, and the knowledge cut deeply. "Vittorio," she said again, louder this time. The words seemed to hover in the air between them, charged with all they had been and might have been. His head snapped up, eyes widening in surprise before narrowing with hurt and anger. He straightened in his chair, his posture defensive, guarded. "How did you get in here?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Your father gave me the code," she admitted. "Please, just give me 5 minutes. Then if you want me to leave, I will." She remained in the doorway, not daring to enter his space without permission. Vittorio laughed humorlessly, taking a sip of his whiskey. "My father? Now that's ironic." He set the glass down carefully, almost deliberately, a man clinging to control when everything else was chaos. "He's worried about you." She took a tentative step forward, then stopped when he tensed. "And he sent you? The person who betrayed me?" He set his glass down with more force than necessary, amber liquid sloshing over the rim. "He must be more desperate than I thought." The barb stung, but Ajin pressed on. "I deserve that. I deserve your anger and your distrust. But please, just listen. Just once." Her voice caught on the last word, betraying the emotion she was trying to control. Vittorio leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "Fine. 5 minutes. Then you leave, and we never see each other again." The finality in his voice made her heart sink, but she had expected nothing less. Ajin nodded, accepting his terms. She moved closer to his desk but remained standing, unwilling to assume even the smallest comfort without permission. The city lights behind him created a halo effect, silhouetting his profile against the night. "I was 16 when my parents died," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "They didn't die in a simple car accident. My father drove them both off a bridge after his embezzlement scheme was discovered. He had stolen millions from his clients, and when he was caught, he chose to end it all, taking my mother with him." Vittorio's expression remained impassive, but she could tell he was listening. The hardness in his eyes didn't soften, but he didn't interrupt. "I was left with nothing," she continued. "No money, no family willing to take me in, just the shame of being the daughter of a criminal. That's when Park Do-hyun found me. He offered me a job, a place to stay, a purpose. All I had to do was become a tutor and companion to a young boy in a wealthy family." Understanding dawned in Vittorio's eyes. "Me." The single syllable was flat, emotionless. She nodded. "You. I didn't know at first that I was being used as a spy. Park told me he was a close friend of your father, that he wanted reports on your well-being because your father was too busy to check himself. I believed him." The admission sounded hollow, naive even to her own ears. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The city outside continued its nightly rhythm, cars moving along streets, lights switching on and off in distant buildings, all unaware of the drama unfolding in this high-rise sanctuary. By the time I realized what was really happening, that Park was using me to gather information to force your father out of his company, I had already grown attached to you. You were this bright, curious little boy who loved stories and had too few people who really saw you." Her voice softened at the memory, warmth entering her tone despite herself. "I tried to back out, but Park threatened to expose my parents' past, to make sure I would be just as disgraced as they were." Vittorio's hard expression faltered slightly, a crack in the armor he had erected around himself. "So I gave him what seemed like harmless information, schedules, visitor names, bits of conversation I overheard. I thought I was protecting you by not sharing anything too personal." She sighed, the weight of old guilt pressing down. "I was naive. Your father found my notebook, and I was terminated immediately. Park abandoned me, cut all ties, and left me to fend for myself. I fled to Italy, terrified of the consequences, carrying only my guilt and the memory of a little boy asking why his favorite tutor had disappeared without saying goodbye." Ajin felt tears welling but forced them back. This wasn't about her pain, it was about his. "I never expected to see you again. The accident was real, I had no idea you were in Milan until that day. When I recognized you, I should have told you immediately. But I was afraid. Afraid of your reaction, afraid of facing my past, afraid of losing this new life I'd built." She took a deep breath before continuing, forcing herself to meet his gaze directly. "The more time we spent together, the harder it became to tell you the truth. I fell in love with you, Vittorio. Not the little boy I once knew, but the man you've become. Strong, passionate, surprisingly kind. Every day I didn't tell you made it worse, I know that. But everything between us these past months has been real. Every moment, every word, every feeling. She met his gaze directly now, her heart in her eyes. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to believe that my love for you is real. That's all. Her 5 minutes were up. She had said what she came to say. Without waiting for his response, she turned to leave, her chest tight with unshed tears. Each step toward the door felt like walking through deep water, her legs heavy, her movements slow. Jean, Vittorio's voice stopped her at the doorway. Wait. She turned back slowly, afraid to hope. He stood now, moving from behind his desk with deliberate steps until he was standing before her. The distance between them was physical but also emotional, a chasm created by secrets and betrayal. When I was 6 years old, he said quietly, my tutor used to read me stories every night before bed. She was the only person in that house who seemed to genuinely care about me, not as the Kong heir, but just as a boy who needed attention. When she disappeared, I was devastated. His voice carried no accusation, just the lingering pain of an old wound. Jean's heart ached at the memory. I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. The apology was inadequate, she knew, but it was all she had to offer. I drew a picture of you, he continued, as if he hadn't heard her. I kept it hidden in a book because my father had forbidden anyone to speak your name. I would look at it when I felt alone, which was often. He moved to a nearby bookshelf and pulled out an old, leather-bound volume. From between its pages, he extracted a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He handed it to her. Jean opened it carefully. It was a child's drawing, a stick figure with long black hair standing next to a smaller figure with a big smile. Above them, in childish handwriting, Jean and me. The pencil had faded over time, the paper creased from repeated folding and unfolding, but the image was clear. A fragment of the past, preserved against all odds. You kept this? She whispered, her fingers tracing the faded lines. The revelation staggered her, that he had held on to this small piece of her through all these years. For 20 years, he confirmed. Even when I couldn't remember your face clearly, I kept it. When I saw you in the hospital after the accident, something about you seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. He shook his head. How did I not recognize you? I was different then, she said softly. We both were. The years stretched between them, a bridge rather than a barrier. Vittorio studied her face, as if seeing her anew. You lied to me. The statement was factual, not accusatory. Yes, she admitted, not looking away from his gaze. The truth was a relief after months of evasion. You manipulated me. Not intentionally, but yes, the result was the same. She accepted each charge without defense. There was freedom in this confession, in finally facing the consequences of her actions. You broke my trust. She nodded, accepting each accusation without defense. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with decisions yet to be made. But, he continued, his voice softening, you also showed me what it means to slow down. To appreciate simple moments. To be present. His hand reached up to touch her cheek gently. You taught me how to listen to the silence without fearing it. Jean leaned into his touch, hardly daring to breathe. His fingers were warm against her skin, familiar and yet somehow new, as if they were touching for the first time. I'm still angry, Vittorio admitted. I'm hurt. I don't know if I can trust you again. His honesty was brutal but necessary, a foundation upon which something real might be built. I understand, she said, beginning to pull away, preparing herself for the final rejection. His hand on her cheek stopped her. But I want to try. 3 simple words, but they contained worlds of possibility. Tears spilled down her cheeks at his words. Why? The question emerged broken, disbelieving. Because I love you, he said simply. Despite everything, I love you. And I think I've been loving you since I was 6 years old. The confession was raw, unguarded, offered without expectation. Jean choked back a sob, overwhelmed by emotions she'd held in check for so long. I don't deserve your love. The words were barely audible, whispered into the small space between them. Probably not, he agreed with a ghost of his usual smile. But you have it anyway. His thumb wiped away a tear tracking down her cheek, the gesture tender despite everything. Slowly, hesitantly, he lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a declaration. Their lips met in the barest touch, a reconnection that held both forgiveness and caution. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment the world shifted back onto its axis. When they parted, Vittorio rested his forehead against hers. This won't be easy, he warned. We have a lot to work through. His breath mingled with hers, warm in the cool air of the office. I know, she whispered. I'm not asking for easy. Just for a chance. Her hands found his, fingers intertwining in tentative reconciliation. A chance, he repeated thoughtfully. I think we both deserve that much. The city lights behind them continued their silent vigil, witnesses to this fragile new beginning born from the ashes of deceit. Recovery was neither swift nor simple. Trust, once broken, could not be mended overnight, no matter how sincere the apologies or how deep the love. In the weeks that followed their reconciliation, Vittorio and Augine moved cautiously around each other, navigating the new landscape of their relationship with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The holiday season passed in a strange limbo, neither fully together nor properly apart. They celebrated Christmas quietly, exchanging modest gifts that spoke of careful optimism rather than grand promises. They talked, really talked, about everything they had left unsaid before. Long conversations stretched into the night, sometimes calm and reflective, other times heated and painful. No topic was off limits, no question too difficult to ask or answer. As winter deepened, snow blanketing Milan in periodic white silence, they peeled away layers of deception and misunderstanding, replacing them with a tentative but growing honesty. Augine shared stories of her brief time in his childhood home, filling in gaps in Vittorio's memories. She told him about the books they had read together, the small rituals they had established, hot chocolate on rainy days, a particular stuffed bear that had to be positioned just so before bedtime, the songs she had sung when nightmares disturbed his sleep. The memories both pained and comforted him, pieces of a childhood he had only partially remembered. He, in turn, told her about the years after she left, his struggle to connect with his father, his rebellion against family expectations, his eventual escape to Italy to build something of his own. He described the loneliness that had driven him to seek extremes, fast cars, casual relationships, the constant need for movement and distraction. The roots of his adult behaviors became clearer in the light of their shared past. I used to dream about finding you, he admitted one evening as they walked along the Navigli canals, the Christmas decorations still hanging but now tinged with the melancholy of a holiday past. The water was partially frozen, ice forming intricate patterns along the edges of the canal. After you disappeared, I would make up stories about where you had gone and why you couldn't say goodbye. In some versions, you were a princess who had to return to your kingdom. In others, you were a spy. He laughed softly at the irony. I guess that one was closest to the truth. Not the whole truth, Augine corrected gently. I really did care about you. That wasn't an act. She pulled her coat tighter as a gust of January wind cut through the canal. Vittorio squeezed her hand. I know that now. The words were simple but profound, an acknowledgement of how far they had come, how much understanding had grown between them. They were careful not to rush, building a foundation of honesty where before there had been secrets. Some days were easier than others. There were moments when doubt would cloud Vittorio's eyes, when a casual question about her past would be infused with suspicion he couldn't quite hide. There were nights when Augine would wake in a cold sweat, convinced that what they were building was too fragile to last, that the universe would not allow her this second chance at happiness. In those moments, Augine reminded herself that patience was the price of redemption. She answered every question, no matter how painful, with complete honesty. She learned to recognize the signs of his withdrawal and to give him space when needed, rather than retreating herself. Slowly, day by day, they rebuilt what had been broken, not as it was before, but as something new, something stronger for having been tested. Gradually, step by step, they found their way back to each other, not as the people they had pretended to be, but as who they truly were, with all their flaws and complexities laid bare. January gave way to February, the bitter cold of deep winter beginning to ease its grip on the city. As daylight lengthened incrementally, so too did the moments of genuine connection between them. One snowy evening in late January, Vittorio surprised Augine at the bookstore just as she was closing up. Business had been slow due to the weather, most Milanese choosing to stay home rather than venture into the swirling snow. She looked up from the register to find him standing in the doorway, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, his eyes bright with a suppressed excitement she hadn't seen in months. Pack a bag, he said without preamble. We're going on a trip. A trip? She echoed, locking the register. The question held a wariness that hadn't been present in their earlier relationship. Trust was still a fragile construct between them. It's a surprise, he replied mysteriously. But you'll need warm clothes. His smile was cautious but genuine, an invitation rather than a demand. Intrigued, Augine quickly finished closing the store and let him drive her to her apartment to pack. An hour later, they were in his car heading north out of Milan. The snow had stopped, leaving the countryside transformed into a winter wonderland, the late afternoon sun casting long blue shadows across pristine fields. They drove in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly, each lost in their own thoughts. Will you at least tell me how long we'll be gone? She asked, watching as the city lights gave way to darkness. The headlights illuminated swirling snow particles, creating the illusion of traveling through stars. Just the weekend, he assured her. Elena can handle the store, right? His question was careful, conscious of her need for independence, for control over her own domain. Yes, but no more questions, he said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Trust me. The request was simple but loaded with meaning. Trust was exactly what had been broken between them, what they were struggling to rebuild. The irony of his choice of words wasn't lost on either of them. Trust was still fragile between them, a delicate construct they were rebuilding day by day. Ajin nodded, choosing to accept the invitation without further question. The car continued north, climbing into the mountains as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging in a clear winter sky. After about 2 hours of driving through the darkness, they began to climb into the mountains. Snow-laden trees lined the winding road, appearing ghostly in the headlights. The car's heating system worked steadily to combat the dropping temperature outside. As they climbed higher, the radio signal began to fade, replaced by a comfortable silence broken only by the sound of tires on snow-covered roads. Finally, Vittorio turned onto a narrow, private drive that led to a small, elegant chalet nestled among the pines. Warm light glowed from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney, dissipating into the clear night air. The building was modest by Vittorio's standards but exquisite in its craftsmanship, traditional Alpine architecture updated with modern touches. What is this place? Ajin asked as he parked the car. The snow crunched beneath the tires as they came to a stop, the engine's rumble fading to silence. My sanctuary, he replied, a certain vulnerability in his voice. I bought it 5 years ago. It's where I come when the world gets too loud. He turned off the ignition, the sudden quiet almost palpable after the constant hum of the journey. The significance of his bringing her here wasn't lost on Ajin. This wasn't just a weekend getaway, it was Vittorio sharing a part of himself he kept private from the rest of the world. The night air was crisp and cold as they stepped out of the car, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Stars blazed overhead, more brilliant than she had ever seen them, free from Milan's light pollution. Inside, the chalet was warm and inviting, rustic yet luxurious, with exposed wooden beams, plush furnishings, and a massive stone fireplace dominating the main room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered what would be a spectacular view of the mountains in daylight. A fire already burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the wood-paneled walls, suggesting that someone had prepared for their arrival. It's beautiful, Ajin said softly, taking in the space. She removed her coat, hanging it on a wooden peg by the door, her eyes drawn to the personal touches that marked the space as Vittorio's, a stack of books beside a comfortable armchair, an old record player in the corner, a collection of vintage cameras displayed on a shelf. I've never brought anyone here before, Vittorio admitted, setting down their bags. Not even my father knows about this place. He moved to stoke the fire, adding another log, the flames leaping higher in response. The weight of his trust settled over her like a warm blanket. Thank you for sharing it with me. She joined him by the fire, drawn to its warmth after the chill of the journey. He smiled, the firelight casting shadows across his face. Are you hungry? I had the caretaker stock the kitchen. They prepared dinner together, moving around the kitchen with an easy synchronicity that belied the complexities of their relationship. Vittorio chopped vegetables while Ajin prepared pasta, the simplicity of the task allowing conversation to flow naturally. The kitchen was modern but designed to blend with the rustic architecture, all wood and stone with state-of-the-art appliances discreetly integrated. Over pasta and wine, they talked of small things, books Ajin had ordered for the store, a new hotel Vittorio was considering in Barcelona, the unusually heavy snowfall this winter. The mundane topics were comforting, a return to normalcy after months of emotional intensity. After dinner, they settled on the plush rug before the fireplace, wine glasses in hand, watching the flames dance. Outside, the wind had picked up, occasionally sending gusts of snow against the windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety within. I spoke with my father yesterday, Vittorio said after a comfortable silence. His voice was casual but his eyes watchful, gauging her reaction. Ajin tensed slightly. Though Jinwoo had helped bring them back together, she still felt uneasy when he was mentioned. Oh? She took a sip of wine, using the action to mask her discomfort. He asked about you, Vittorio continued, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. He wanted to know if we were still together. And what did you tell him? She set her glass down, focusing on the smooth movement to steady her nerves. The truth. That we're working through things. That it's not easy, but it's worth it. His gaze held hers, intent and earnest in the firelight. Ajin relaxed slightly, warmed by his words. That's a good way to put it. She leaned back against the sofa behind them, the tension in her shoulders easing. He also told me something interesting, Vittorio said, setting down his wine glass. He said that after you were discovered, he had you investigated. Ajin's stomach dropped. What? The single word emerged sharper than intended, fear flaring instinctively. He wanted to know who had sent you, what information you had passed on, if you posed a continued threat. Vittorio's expression was unreadable in the firelight, his face partially shadowed. What he found was a frightened teenager who had been manipulated by a man with no morals. He found that the information you had shared was largely inconsequential: schedules, visitors, surface-level conversations. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. My father believes you were trying to protect us, in your own way. That's why he gave you the security code to my penthouse. Tears pricked at Ajin's eyes. I never thought he would understand. The revelation was stunning, that the man whose fury had haunted her nightmares for years had seen the truth of her situation more clearly than she had expected. Neither did I, Vittorio admitted. My father isn't known for his forgiveness. But he sees something in you worth forgiving. His thumb traced patterns on her palm, small circles that soothed as much as they excited. So do I. Ajin swallowed hard, trying to contain the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I don't deserve either of you. The words emerged as barely more than a whisper, lost in the crackle of the fire. It's not about deserving, Vittorio said softly. It's about choosing. And I choose you, Ajin. Every day, with open eyes, knowing everything, I choose you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. The firelight caught the velvet, making it glow deep red against his palm. Ajin's breath caught in her throat. Vittorio. Her heart began to race, fear and hope warring within her. This isn't a proposal, he clarified quickly, opening the box to reveal a delicate silver ring set with a small sapphire. Not yet. We're not ready for that. But it is a promise. The stone caught the firelight, sending blue reflections dancing across their faces. He took the ring from its box and held it out to her. This was my grandmother's. She left it to me with instructions to give it to the woman who made me want to be a better man. His eyes were serious in the firelight, reflecting the dancing flames. That's you, Ajin. You make me want to be better, to slow down, to listen, to make peace with my past. Ajin felt tears spill onto her cheeks as he continued. The simple sincerity of his words touched something deep within her, a place she had thought permanently scarred by her past. This ring is a promise that I'm committed to us, to working through our past and building our future. If you accept it, it means you're making the same promise. He held it between them, offering not just the ring but a future neither had believed possible months ago. With trembling fingers, Ajin reached out and touched the ring. Are you sure? After everything? The question contained all her fears, all her doubts about whether something built on such a foundation could truly last. I've never been more sure of anything, he replied with quiet certainty. In his eyes, she saw the steadiness she had always admired, the strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Ajin smiled through her tears, extending her right hand. Then I promise. The words were simple but profound, a covenant between them that transcended their complicated history. Vittorio slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. No more secrets, he murmured against her skin. No more running. No more secrets, she agreed. No more running. The ring felt right on her finger, as if it had been designed for her. The sapphire glowed in the firelight, a small beacon of possibility. That night, as they lay together in the master bedroom, snow falling softly outside the windows, Ajin felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The burden she had carried for so long, the guilt, the fear, the secrets, had lifted, replaced by the exhilarating lightness of truth. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting silver patterns across the bed, the mountains outside standing sentinel in the darkness. What are you thinking? Vittorio asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. His voice was drowsy, content, a marked contrast to the tightly controlled man she had first met. That I never expected this, she replied honestly. After the dinner with your father, I thought I'd lost you forever. I thought I'd have to leave Milan, start over somewhere new. She nestled closer, drawing comfort from his warmth. And would you have? He asked. Left Italy? His hand paused its movement, waiting for her answer. Ajin considered this. Eventually, yes. There would have been too many memories. The admission cost her something, a recognition of how deeply he had already embedded himself in her life before the revelation. Vittorio pulled her closer. Then I'm glad my father meddled for once in his life. I can't imagine my world without you in it. His arms tightened around her, as if the mere thought of her absence was physically painful. She nestled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Vittorio? There's something I've been wondering. Her voice was quiet in the darkness, curious rather than anxious. HM? His response was lazy, content, the sound of a man at peace. Why did you come looking for me after the accident? You didn't even know me, or thought you didn't. Why was it so important to find me? The question had lingered for months, never quite addressed in the tumult of revelations and reconciliations. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still stroking her shoulder. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than tense. I told you about my grandmother, how she practically raised me. Yes. Jean shifted slightly to look up at him, catching the silver of moonlight on his profile. The night before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said that there are certain people who come into our lives for a reason, people who change our course, who help us become who we're meant to be. His voice grew softer, more reflective, tinged with the reverence he always showed when speaking of his grandmother. When I opened my eyes in that hospital room and saw you standing there, something inside me recognized you. Not as the tutor from my childhood, I didn't make that connection until much later. But as someone significant. Someone who would change everything. And did I? Jean asked, raising her head to look at him. The question held no coyness, only genuine curiosity about his perception. Vittorio smiled, touching her cheek gently. Look at me. 6 months ago, I was racing down mountain roads at dangerous speeds because I couldn't stand to be alone with my thoughts. Now I'm here, in this quiet place, with you in my arms, and I'm completely at peace. He kissed her forehead. Yes, Jean. You changed everything. Spring arrived in Milan with a burst of color and warmth. The trees lining the streets bloomed with pink and white blossoms, and cafes moved their tables outdoors to catch the pleasant sunshine. The transition happened gradually, first snowdrops pushing through the last patches of snow, then crocuses and daffodils, finally the explosion of cherry blossoms and magnolias that transformed the parks and avenues. For Vittorio and Jean, it was a season of renewal in more ways than one. Their relationship, tested by the harsh winter of truth, had emerged stronger and more vibrant than before. Each day brought new growth, new understanding, the painful past receding like winter snow before the warmth of their deepening connection. Jean's bookstore flourished, attracting a growing clientele drawn to its cozy atmosphere and carefully curated selection. She had expanded the children's section, hosting weekend reading hours that became popular with local families. With Vittorio's encouragement, she had also begun organizing author events and literary discussions that drew intellectuals and book lovers from across the city. Vittorio had scaled back his workaholic tendencies, delegating more responsibilities to his capable staff and finding time to pursue interests beyond the business. He had taken up photography again, a passion from his university days that had been set aside in his pursuit of success. On weekends, he and Jean would often explore the countryside around Milan, his camera capturing the beauty of northern Italy while she discovered hidden bookshops in small towns. Together, they had found a rhythm that accommodated both their independent lives and their shared one. They spent most nights together, either at his penthouse or her apartment, but maintained their separate spaces, a mutual recognition of their need for occasional solitude. They still faced challenges, of course. Vittorio's fame occasionally brought unwanted attention, especially after a business magazine ran a feature on their relationship, complete with speculation about their future. Paparazzi had caught them leaving a restaurant one evening, leading to a flurry of articles about the mysterious woman who tamed Milan's most eligible bachelor. The publicity had been uncomfortable for Jean, who valued her privacy, but they had weathered it together, laughing over the more outlandish speculations. Jean still struggled with insecurity at times, questioning whether she truly belonged in Vittorio's world of wealth and influence. The sapphire ring on her right hand helped, a constant reminder of his choice, his commitment. But there were moments, at elegant business functions or charity galas, when she felt like an imposter, waiting to be discovered and expelled. But they faced these challenges together, with honesty and patience, building a foundation strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. Winter thawed into spring, and with it, the last ice around their hearts melted away, leaving a warmth and trust that deepened with each passing day. One warm afternoon in late April, Vittorio surprised Jean at the bookstore, arriving with a picnic basket in hand. The day was perfect, clear blue sky, gentle breeze, the first real warmth of the year after months of cold. Potted flowers had appeared outside cafes and shops, tulips and hyacinths adding splashes of color to the city streets. Close early, he suggested, his eyes bright with excitement. It's too beautiful to stay indoors. He set the basket on the counter, its contents emitting tantalizing aromas of fresh bread and cheese. Jean glanced around the empty store, considering. It had been a slow day, the pleasant weather drawing people to parks rather than bookshops. Let me just call Elena to see if she can close up later if any customers come by. Once arrangements were made, they strolled to a nearby park, finding a secluded spot beneath a flowering cherry tree. Vittorio spread a blanket on the grass and began unpacking the basket, cheese, bread, fresh fruit, and a bottle of chilled wine. The tree above them was in full bloom, occasional petals drifting down to land on the blanket like pink snow. "What's the occasion?" Ajin asked, helping to arrange the food. A group of children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. "Do we need one?" he countered with a smile. "Maybe I just wanted to spend the afternoon with the woman I love." He poured wine into 2 glasses, the pale gold liquid catching the sunlight. She laughed, accepting the glass he offered. "Fair enough." The wine was crisp and cold, perfect for the warm day. They ate leisurely, enjoying the simple pleasure of good food and good company in the dappled shade. Birds sang in the branches above them, bees hummed among the flowers, and the world seemed in perfect harmony. Ajin was in the middle of sharing an amusing anecdote about a particularly fussy customer when she noticed Vittorio's attention had shifted. Following his gaze, she saw a familiar figure approaching their picnic spot, Jin Wukong, looking somewhat out of place in his formal business attire. He seemed older in the bright spring light, the lines on his face more pronounced than she remembered. As he walked toward them, Ajin felt a momentary flicker of the old fear, quickly replaced by a cautious acceptance. "Father," Vittorio said, rising to his feet in surprise. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in Seoul." There was no tension in his voice, only genuine curiosity. "I arrived this morning," Jinwoo replied, nodding a greeting to Ajin. "Your assistant told me I might find you here." He glanced around the park, taking in the flowering trees, the families enjoying the sunshine, the couple on a nearby bench sharing ice cream. "Is something wrong?" Vittorio asked, a note of concern in his voice. He moved slightly closer to Ajin, a subtle protective gesture. Jinwoo shook his head. "Nothing's wrong. May I join you for a moment?" Despite the phrasing, it wasn't really a question. Jin Wukong was not a man accustomed to asking permission. Vittorio glanced at Ajin, who nodded her assent. "Of course." The older man lowered himself onto the blanket with unexpected grace, politely declining the wine Vittorio offered. "I won't stay long. I know you were enjoying your afternoon." He arranged himself formally, his posture impossibly straight despite sitting on the ground. "What brings you to Milan, Mr. Kong?" Ajin asked, trying to ease the subtle tension that had arisen with his arrival. A cherry blossom drifted down, landing on Jinwoo's immaculate suit jacket. He brushed it away with a practiced flick of his fingers. "Business, primarily," he replied. "But also some personal matters." He looked at his son. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last meeting, Vittorio. About our family, about the past, about what's truly important." Vittorio's expression remained guarded, but Ajin could sense his curiosity. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that was as much for his comfort as hers. "When your mother left," Jinwoo continued, "I threw myself into building the business. I told myself it was for you, to create a legacy, to secure your future. But the truth is, I was hiding from the pain, from the fear of failing as a father the way I had failed as a husband." The raw honesty in his words surprised both Vittorio and Ajin. Jin Wukong had never struck either of them as a man given to emotional revelations. A child's laugh rang out from somewhere in the park, a counterpoint to the serious conversation unfolding beneath the cherry tree. "I pushed you too hard," Jinwoo admitted. "I tried to mold you into a version of myself, instead of seeing the remarkable man you were becoming on your own. And when you rebelled, when you left for Italy and built your own success, I was too proud to acknowledge that you were right to forge your own path." Vittorio sat very still, his face revealing nothing of the emotional turmoil Ajin suspected was churning beneath the surface. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, the only outward sign of his reaction. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked quietly. A breeze stirred the branches above them, sending another shower of pink petals drifting down around them. Jinwoo reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document, offering it to his son. "Because life is too short for pride and stubbornness. Because I've seen how happy you are with Ajin, and I want that kind of happiness for you in every aspect of your life." Vittorio took the document but didn't open it. "What is this?" He held it carefully, as if it might burn him. "The deed to the family home in Seoul," Jinwoo replied. "I'm transferring it to your name." Vittorio's composure cracked, his eyes widening in shock. "The house? But why?" The question contained decades of complexity, the weight of tradition, the expectations of inheritance, the symbolic significance of the family home. "It should have been yours years ago," Jinwoo said simply. "It was your grandmother's wish that you have it." He straightened his tie, a nervous gesture at odds with his usual composed demeanor. "I don't understand," Vittorio shook his head. "Why now?" The question was about far more than the timing of a property transfer. Jinwoo glanced at Ajin, then back to his son. "Because I've realized that family, real family, is about more than bloodlines or tradition or duty. It's about love, forgiveness, and second chances." He smiled faintly. "Things I've been rather slow to learn." Vittorio looked down at the document in his hands, then back up at his father. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you," he said finally. "This means a lot to me." The simple words carried the weight of years of conflict and misunderstanding. "There's one more thing," Jinwoo said, rising to his feet. "I'm stepping down as CEO of Kong Industries." "What?" Vittorio stood as well, his shock evident. "But the company is your life." He helped Ah-jin to her feet, the three of them now standing in a loose triangle beneath the cherry tree. "It was," Jinwoo corrected. "But I'm finding that at my age, there are other things I value more." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm not asking you to take over, I know you've built your own empire here. But I would value your input on who should lead the company into the future." The significance of this request wasn't lost on Vittorio. It was an acknowledgement of his business acumen, a sign of respect from a father who had rarely offered it. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The words were simple but contained a world of meaning, acceptance, forgiveness, the beginning of a new relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Jinwoo nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now, I'll leave you two to enjoy the rest of your afternoon." He turned to Ah-jin, his expression softening. "Take care of my son, Miss Lee. He needs someone who sees him clearly." "I will," she promised, sensing that this was as close to a blessing as she would get from Jinwoo Kong. The older man nodded once more, then walked away, his straight back and measured stride projecting authority even in retreat. After he left, Vittorio sat back down beside Ah-jin, still holding the deed to the family home. "Well," he said after a moment, "that was unexpected." He set the document carefully aside, as if still processing its significance. Ah-jin smiled, squeezing his hand. "Your father is full of surprises lately." She poured more wine into their glasses, the normalcy of the action providing an anchor after the emotional intensity of Jinwoo's visit. "Indeed." Vittorio set the document aside and reached for his wine glass. "First he helps you find me after our fight, then he hands over the family home and announces his retirement. I'm beginning to wonder if he's been replaced by a doppelganger." He took a sip, the sunlight filtering through the pale liquid as he raised the glass. She laughed softly. "Or maybe he's just realized what truly matters, like he said." A child ran past their blanket, chasing a butterfly, momentarily connecting them to the simple joy of the spring afternoon. "Maybe." Vittorio took a thoughtful sip of wine. "It's strange, for years, all I wanted was his approval, his acknowledgement that I had succeeded on my own terms. Now that I have it, I find that it matters less than I expected." "Because you don't need it anymore," Ah-jin suggested. "You know your own worth now." She began to gather the remains of their picnic, placing empty containers back in the basket. He smiled, pulling her close. "I had a good teacher." He kissed her temple, his lips warm against her skin. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the afternoon sun filtered through the cherry blossoms above them. The park had grown busier as the day progressed, more families arriving to enjoy the perfect spring weather. A group of teenagers played frisbee in an open area nearby, their shouts and laughter adding to the atmosphere of casual joy. "What will you do with the house?" Ah-jin asked eventually. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders a comforting weight. Vittorio considered this. "I'm not sure. I haven't been back to Seoul in years." He traced patterns on her shoulder, his touch light and thoughtful. A thought occurred to her, one she hesitated to voice for fear of presuming too much. "Maybe we could visit? Sometime this summer, perhaps?" The suggestion was tentative, a recognition of how far they had come but also how much further they might go. The "we" hung in the air between them, a simple pronoun weighted with significance. It implied a future, an assumption of togetherness that they had been careful not to take for granted during their reconciliation. Vittorio's eyes softened as he gazed at her. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like to show you my hometown, the places that were important to me growing up." His smile was warm, unguarded in a way it rarely had been before. "And maybe," Ah-jin added tentatively, "we could look for my old neighborhood too? I haven't been back since I left." The suggestion was both an offering and a request, a willingness to face her own past as well as share in his. "Of course," he agreed immediately. "We'll face our pasts together." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing the knuckle just above where his grandmother's ring now sat. The simple statement contained within it all the understanding and support that had grown between them in recent months. They were no longer running from their shared history, but embracing it as part of the foundation of their relationship. The past remained, its influence undeniable, but it no longer defined them or determined their future. As the afternoon waned, they packed up their picnic and walked hand in hand back toward the bookstore. The streets of Milan were alive with the energy of spring, cafe tables filled with people enjoying the sunshine, street musicians playing cheerful melodies, children running and laughing. The winter's cold was a distant memory, replaced by the vibrant promise of new beginnings. "I love this city," Ajin remarked as they paused to watch a street artist creating a chalk masterpiece on the pavement. The drawing depicted a young couple beneath a flowering tree, the resemblance to their own afternoon striking enough to make her smile. "It's given me so much, a home, a purpose, and now you." She leaned into Vittorio, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence beside her. Vittorio smiled, pulling her closer to his side. "Perhaps we should thank that rainy road where we collided." His tone was light, but his eyes held a deeper truth, an acknowledgement of how fate, chance, or perhaps something more deliberate had brought them together against all odds. "I think I'd rather thank you for driving too fast," she teased, nudging him playfully. An elderly couple passed them, holding hands after what must have been decades together, offering a glimpse of a possible future. "And I'll thank you for being in the wrong place at exactly the right time," he countered, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. The gesture was casual, comfortable, the action of a man who expected many more such moments in the years ahead. When they reached the bookstore, Ajin was surprised to find it busy with customers, Elena efficiently managing the register. The bell chimed as they entered, several patrons looking up from the books they were browsing. "It got busy after you left," Elena explained with a smile. "A blog mentioned us as one of Milan's hidden literary gems." She handed a wrapped package to a customer, exchanging pleasantries in rapid Italian. "That's wonderful," Ajin exclaimed. "I'd better help you." She moved to set down the picnic basket, already shifting mental gears to her professional role. Vittorio squeezed her hand. "I'll see you tonight? Dinner at my place?" "I'll be there," she promised, her smile holding all the warmth that had grown between them. The simple exchange contained within it the comfortable routine they had established, the balance of separation and togetherness that worked for them both. As he turned to leave, a young woman approached the counter with a stack of books and a hesitant smile. Her features marked her as Asian, perhaps Korean or Japanese, her halting Italian suggesting she was relatively new to the country. "Excuse me," she said in halting Italian, "are you Lee Ajin? The owner?" "Yes, I am," Ajin replied, switching to English upon hearing the woman's accent. She set down the picnic basket, giving the young woman her full attention. "I read about your store online," the woman continued, visibly relieved at the language change. "I'm Korean too, just moved to Milan for university. I was hoping maybe you could recommend some books to help me improve my Italian?" As Ajin began helping the student, showing her various language resources and easy-to-read Italian novels, she felt a familiar gaze on her. Glancing up, she saw Vittorio still standing in the doorway, watching her with a smile that conveyed more than words ever could. In his eyes she saw pride, love, and a deep contentment that echoed her own feelings. In that moment, surrounded by books, helping a fellow expatriate find her way in a new city, with the man she loved looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, Ajin felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. This was where she was meant to be. Not because fate had ordained it, but because she had found the courage to face her past, to tell the truth, to open her heart to the possibility of love, even with the risk of loss. The past remained, its lessons valuable, but it no longer defined her or limited her future. And Vittorio, watching from the doorway, seemed to read her thoughts in her expression. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of all they had overcome and all that lay ahead, before stepping out into the Milan sunshine. Their story, like all great stories, was not without its complications and challenges. But as Ajin had once told Vittorio, the best stories weren't about perfect people living perfect lives, they were about flawed individuals finding their way towards something true and meaningful. Together, they had written a new chapter. And though neither knew exactly what the future held, they faced it now with open eyes and open hearts, no longer running from the past but embracing it as part of the journey that had brought them home to each other. The Seoul summer humidity hung heavy in the air as Ajin made her way through the crowded market streets. It was early evening, the sky painted in shades of purple and orange, vendors calling out their final sales of the day. The familiar sounds of her native language surrounded her, at once strange and comforting after so many years away. She stopped at a small stall selling fresh flowers, selecting a bouquet of white lilies before continuing on her way. The scent of street food, tagbaki, hadiak, bindiatik, filled the air, awakening memories long dormant. Children ran past her, laughing, their parents calling after them in the rapid-fire Korean that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The cemetery was quiet when she arrived, most visitors having left before the approaching dusk. The contrast between the bustling market streets and this place of silence was jarring, the transition from life to death marked by a simple gate and a change in atmosphere. Ajin moved purposefully through the rows of headstones until she found the one she sought, a simple granite marker bearing her parents' names. She knelt before it, brushing away fallen leaves and small debris that had accumulated since her last visit. "Hello, Mom. Dad," she said softly, placing the lilies before the stone. "It's been a long time." In the 2 years since she and Vittorio had reconciled, they had made this pilgrimage to Seoul 3 times. The first visit had been the hardest, facing the ghosts of her past, showing Vittorio the modest apartment building where she had grown up, finding her parents' grave after 15 years away. She had wept then, overwhelmed by guilt and grief and relief all mingled together. But each visit became easier, the pain of old wounds softening with time and love. Now she could speak to them without her voice breaking, could honor their memory without being crushed by the weight of what had happened. "I'm getting married next month," she told the silent stone. "You would like him, I think. He's stubborn and sometimes too impulsive, but he has a good heart." She smiled softly, picturing Vittorio as he had been that morning, hair tousled from sleep, making coffee in the kitchen of the family home they now shared, his smile when he saw her watching him. "He makes me happy." A gentle hand on her shoulder announced Vittorio's presence. He had given her privacy for her visit, waiting at a respectful distance until she was ready. The sun was setting now, long shadows stretching across the cemetery grounds, the air cooling as day gave way to evening. "Okay?" he asked quietly, his gaze warm with understanding. She nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Yes. I told them about the wedding." Birds were settling in the trees that lined the cemetery paths, their evening songs a reminder that life continued even in this place of remembrance. Vittorio knelt beside her, placing his own small offering before the headstone, a smooth stone from the garden of the family home where they now lived part of the year. The gesture was one he had repeated on each visit, a tradition he had begun without explanation and continued with quiet reverence. "Mr. and Mrs. Lee," he said formally, "I promise to take care of your daughter. To cherish her, to support her dreams, and to remind her every day how remarkable she is." His Korean, which he had been studying diligently, was careful and accented but clear and sincere. Aujin's eyes filled with tears at his simple, heartfelt words. Though her parents couldn't hear him, the gesture meant everything to her. It was an acknowledgement of her past, of the people who had given her life, regardless of how that life had unfolded. As they walked hand in hand back through the cemetery, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, Aujin felt a sense of closure that had eluded her for most of her life. The weight she had carried for so long, guilt, shame, fear, had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something she could carry without being crushed by it. "Thank you," she said, squeezing Vittorio's hand. The evening air was warm against their skin, the distant sound of traffic a reminder of the vibrant city that surrounded this quiet sanctuary. He smiled, pulling her closer. "For what?" His arm around her waist was solid, grounding, a physical reminder of his constant presence. "For loving me through everything. For helping me make peace with my past." She looked up at him, her heart full of the complex love that had grown between them, a love tempered by pain, strengthened by forgiveness, deepened by understanding. "You did the same for me," he reminded her. "We helped each other." The simplicity of the statement belied its profound truth. They had been each other's guides through the labyrinths of their respective pasts, emerging together into a present neither could have imagined alone. When they reached the sleek black car waiting at the cemetery entrance, Jin-woo was standing beside it, his posture more relaxed than Aujin had ever seen during their first encounters. The past 2 years had changed him as well, his hair was now more salt than pepper, his face more lined, but there was a peace about him that had been absent before. Retirement had softened him somewhat, though he still maintained an active role in various business ventures. More importantly, he had become a steadier presence in Vittorio's life, and by extension, in Aujin's. Their relationship was not without its awkward moments, but it had evolved into something approaching genuine respect, perhaps even affection. "All set?" Jin-woo asked as they approached. The question was simple but contained within it a recognition of the emotional weight of this visit, an acknowledgement of its importance. "Yes," Vittorio replied. "We're ready to go home." He opened the car door for Aujin, his hand resting lightly on her back. Home. The word held new meaning now. Not just the renovated family house in Seoul, or Vittorio's penthouse in Milan, or even the small apartment above Aujin's bookstore where she still occasionally stayed when working late. Home was wherever they were together. It was the life they had built despite the odds against them, the trust they had reconstructed from broken pieces, the love that had survived secrets and lies to emerge stronger and truer than before. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Aujin rested her head on Vittorio's shoulder, watching the streets of Seoul pass by through the window. The city had changed in the years she had been away, new buildings, new businesses, a constant evolution that mirrored her own transformation. Yet beneath the changes, its essence remained the same, just as she remained Aujin despite all she had experienced. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice soft in her ear. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "About how sometimes the worst accidents turn out to be the best things that could happen," she replied, thinking of that rainy day on a winding road outside Milan. The memory, once fraught with fear and tension, had softened with time, becoming part of the tapestry of their shared history. Vittorio smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Not an accident, he corrected gently. A collision that was always meant to be. Augine thought of the 6-year-old boy who had drawn her picture and kept it for 20 years. Of the 16-year-old girl who had been sent to spy but had found something to protect instead. Of the adults they had become, carrying their wounds and hopes across oceans and years until they found each other again. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps some collisions were inevitable, written in the stars or in the secret chambers of the heart. Not accidents at all, but destinations they had always been traveling toward, even when the road seemed darkest. Either way, she said, lacing her fingers through his, I'm glad we crashed into each other. The car moved through the sole evening, carrying them toward a future bright with possibility. So am I, Vittorio replied, his eyes full of all the tomorrows stretching before them. So am I. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.